She works in the area of women's health, gender issues, and qualitative research. And she's going to speak on what the numbers can tell us and what they simply cannot.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Do you have my slides?
Yes, I'm just going to share that.
Okay,
Yeah.
if you can just share that. So thank you for the introduction. And it's really, really good to be sharing this platform with all of you. So Wendy Zwana approached me to be one of the speakers and talk about mathematics and the pandemics. The pandemic, I thought, what do I know about mathematics and what can my contribution be? And so I guess the closest that I could get to the maths issue was through statistics, which is an area that I'm fairly familiar with. And so thinking about this whole area of mathematics in the pandemic, I talked about it in terms of numbers and what numbers generally can tell us, but for me, what it largely omits. And so I want to talk about something which is also quite controversial at the moment, and it has to do with the schools, public schools that have been shut down again by the presidency. And I want to use that as an example to talk about numbers, what they do tell us and what they simply cannot. So you can go to the next slide. So this is a letter that we received from, you can move to the next slide. The slide is still on the same one. Anyway, I'll continue. So we received a letter from the school, which is a private school, and this is basically what it said. We are well aware of the all-too-real threat posed by COVID-19 in our daily lives, but we remain confident that our schools are well-positioned and comprehensively resourced to mitigate the risk of infection effectively. The standard operating procedures have been tried and tested on school campuses over the past 5 weeks and with low levels of infection. As of 22nd July 2020, there are 85 active COVID-19 cases among staff across the country, which includes admin staff, teachers, and support staff. This amounts to 1.37% of staff. In addition, the daily reports submitted by all of our schools nationwide and of learners are used to monitor COVID-19 related incidents. 133 learners have been tested positive for COVID-19 since the 1st of June, when the first grades returned to class. This amounts to 0.22% of learners in the grades that have returned to class, and many of these children have recovered. No deaths of the learners have been reported, and these numbers are in accordance with the advice received from health experts that children in general are less likely to get or spread COVID-19 or to get seriously ill. So I looked at those statistics and asked myself, well, what do these numbers tell us? And in my view, this is basically what it says. The numbers tell us what is happening at a given cluster of private schools in South Africa at a given point in time. They point to the current rates of infection, and comparatively speaking, these infection rates among staff and students are low within this given cohort. The bottom line to their communication was this. This is clear evidence of the effectiveness of the control and compliance measures in place, as well as the capacity of schools in this cluster to successfully combat the spread of infection. Now, when I unpack that last statement, I think it's hugely open for debate. I think we can talk about this from a number of angles, but this basically is what the school is reporting, the bottom line of having reopened and with learners back at school and so on. So having looked at this, what does this not tell us? These numbers that they've quoted us, what does it not tell us? In my view, they do not tell us much about the context of that cohort or that grouping of schools, and it doesn't give us a clue about education in schools in South Africa in general. These numbers do not tell us what may unfold in the future within this cohort of schools. And so while the infection rates at the moment appears quite low, it does not tell us what people actually went through, maybe what the learners and staff went through while their colleagues or peers were ill with the virus. These numbers do not tell us what fellow teachers or the learners may have experienced when they discovered their colleagues or peers were diagnosed with the virus. So the numbers tell us very little, in fact. So it's one thing when you aim to speak in general terms about who we are together as a collective entity. The trouble comes in when you try to go the other way, to learn something about us as individuals from how we behave as a collective. And of course, those are the answers that we often want, that we want the most, about what about the individual rather than what happens on average. So in my view, people are not always well represented by averages. And I think the pandemic shows this very, very clearly. If we take another example of gender-based violence, the statistics and the numbers gave us an overall picture of how the incidence and the prevalence of gender-based violence increased, but it does not tell us about the horrors, trauma that people and children, women and children particularly, had to face and go through during this pandemic. There's so much that on an individual level, we simply don't know. For example, why when some people smoke, they do not contract cancer and yet other people do. If we look at the case of twin studies, identical or fraternal twins, while one may remain healthy, another one may become seriously ill, or why some children from similar backgrounds flourish at school while others simply do not. So despite the grand promises of big data, uncertainty remains so abundant that specific human lives remain boundlessly unpredictable. And I think that's the promise for me, that statistics wants to present to us, the promise of prediction, the promise of control, which I think within this pandemic we just did not see. So what is my own position? I'm a researcher and I'm trained in both quantitative and qualitative methods. And in fact, my training was predominantly in quantitative methods. But through the years, I gravitated towards qualitative methods based on my own understanding of what statistics can tell us, but largely what they omit. But I would like to be clear. I'm not discounting statistics and numbers. I'm not saying there's no place in science for stats and for numbers, because there certainly is. What I am arguing for is the limitations attached to viewing social reality purely through statistics and numbers. In my view, at best, statistics tell us what happens on average and aggregates experiences and phenomena into clusters and groups, often leaving out the depth and the real-time experiences of the realities that we purport to study. So what does all of this mean for us? For me, it cautions us to interpret findings in context and not devoid of context. It reminds us that in the social sciences, statistics are about people and their lived realities. And I think this is the danger sometimes that I find with numbers and statistics. It can deface people, and we tend to see things in terms of numbers rather than people's lives. So what does this all mean? It tells us that maths, stats, and data points don't always tell us what is going on and tell it like it is. And those of you who may have watched an interview with Trevor Noah, he interviewed this guy called Nate Silver just after the presidential elections in the United States. And Nate Silver and his organization got the stats horribly wrong. And when he started the interview, he said to Nate Silver, "So what happened? You actually got things wrong." And Nate Silver defended his position and said, "No, I didn't get it wrong. There are no easy explanations to give to you on television. There are no easy television explanations to give." And he actually says at the end of the day that all the predictions, forecasts, and probabilities that were expressed were basically not about predictions, but they were actually an estimate of risk, which poses huge questions, those estimates of risk where he got it horribly, horribly wrong. So sometimes, in my view, I think we need interpretive answers rather than correct answers. And I think that's also would probably be very debatable and very controversial. But I think at the end of the day, in my view, we would need to triangulate our data. And even when we look at the statistical modeling that was used within the pandemic, I read an article yesterday where people heavily criticized the statistical models that were used to make huge decisions about our health, about our economy, and even to the point where the authors of the article were blaming, they were naming and shaming and blaming individuals, top epidemiologists, top statisticians, and saying that they got things horribly, horribly wrong. So I think when we look at statistics, we have to be very, very cautious. And just to end off my last point, within UWC, when we went into lockdown, we were extremely worried about our students who come from very disadvantaged backgrounds, and we were trying to figure out how we were going to level the playing fields. And again, we looked at the numbers of our students, and if I remember from the last tally, we had something like 8,000 students that didn't have data, they didn't have devices, and we needed to really, really put our heads together in terms of how we were going to accommodate these students so that we leave no student behind, which is in line with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And to date, we're still handing out devices, we're still handing out data, and we based our understanding of what was going on in terms of the numbers. What we are now learning is that so many of our students are selling the devices on Gumtree. So while we were looking at the numbers and looking at how best to salvage the situation, I don't think we really had a very good understanding of the qualitative aspects of what we were dealing with. For example, the dire circumstances that our students live in, and the conditions they live under. And even up until yesterday, we were trying to figure out how to reach our students, where their physical places of abode are, so that we could get the devices to them. So the numbers, in fact, tell us very little about the lived realities and the dire circumstances and the conditions that many of our people are faced with, given this particular pandemic. So when I thought about our situation, particularly at UWC, the conclusion I had to come to was that reality has taught us otherwise. The reality which we based our understanding on was based on numbers, was based on stats, but it actually told us very, very little with what we were faced with and what we're going to have to do to salvage the year so that we can complete the 2020 academic year. So in a nutshell, what I am saying is that there is a place for numbers, there is a place for statistics, but we have to interpret our findings within context. We have to interpret it extremely mindfully, and we have to be cautious about the interpretations that we make. Thank you very much.